there's a lot of people, especially in the audience, who would love to write their first book. What
Yeah.
would your biggest tip or advice for them in order to get that done?
Gosh, there's so many tips that I would give. We could do a whole podcast on that alone because I've learned so much over the course of the years,
Let's say your
including a
top
lot
three.
by failure. But let me think if I can give you just one or two that are absolute. Well, the first one is something we talked about a little bit before, but I'll expound upon it. And that is write first, edit second. So allow your thoughts to flow and then go back and see how structured you need to make them. But, write first, edit second. And the second thing I guess would be, if I've always felt that if I make myself laugh, but if I write something and it makes me laugh, it's going to make somebody else laugh. If it makes me cry, it'll probably make someone else cry. And so by writing to one person and making sure the content connects, then you just need to find another, 250,000 people that are sort of like that one person. And that's going to happen from word of mouth. That's going to happen from you out there doing press and media. That's going to happen from just creating a great product or service. In this case, the book. But write something that you're super proud of that connects to you on a deep level. And it's probably going to have that same sort of impact with other people as well.
Thank you. And as a final question, like if you want to create a bestseller, do you have any different approach, like for creating, like when it comes to bestsellers, as opposed to, let's say, just a book that you want to write? Is there any difference, or is it just like identical, everything identical for you?
Well, so I'll tell you one practice that I use is when I finish a book, when I feel, and I'm very, very methodical in terms of the editing process, like I said. So once I've written it, then I go back there and I start the editing process, and I will probably edit a book between 20 and 50 times, going through and making sure I like every single word, every single page. And then when I feel it's there, I will ask 10 people who I really trust to give me what I call very critical feedback. I don't want to hear just, oh, I loved it. What I want to hear is, you know what, that story on page 72, like that brought me to tears. That part on page 96, that felt a little redundant to me. Like, I think you covered that earlier. I want someone who's going to be super honest, super critical. And that's not easy for us to take. We want to hear just, oh, it's great, but allowing ourselves to listen to that critical feedback and then challenging ourselves to make it even better by implementing that feedback is what takes it from a B or a B plus to an A plus plus. And I will say that if you give it to 10 people, and whether this is a book or something else, if one person tells you something, that's an opinion. But if 3 or 4 of the 10 tell you something similar about page 96, you better listen, because it means that when it goes out to the bigger, broader world, 40% of the people are probably going to be having that same reaction, and you've missed the mark in some way, shape, or form. So I always try and think from the reader perspective. How can I create something that is incredible for the reader? Part of that is me and what I'm channeling and what I'm writing. And part of that is the willingness to sit in the hot seat with my focus group and not only listen to what they have to say, but then with the deep sigh, go back to the manuscript and say, okay, how do I make it better? Failure is just staying where you're at, in my experience from my own life, and whatever the place is that I didn't want to be in. I wanted to be somewhere else, but I was so afraid that I'd fail in the process of getting to somewhere else that I didn't want to take any steps. But that by in and of itself is failure.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the ironic thing is you need failure in order to get somewhere, in order to have success. You need failure.
Yeah.
Like you need, like, imagine a child like being eventually able to walk successfully, but before that it'll be a lot of crawling and or falling down, etc., etc. But the good thing with a child is nobody expects the child to be able to walk right away.
Right. Yeah. And learning to speak too, right? A kid learns to speak. And I think one of the things that's important to allow ourselves to remember is that learning is a unique flow, an ebb and a flow, that there are periods of explosive growth in terms of our awareness, our learnings. And this is like language learning to play guitar, learning to program, learning to write well. And then there are plateaus. And then from the plateau, it may be a little frustrating, but then finally you come out of if you keep moving forward out of the plateau, you have another explosion of progress. So the trick is to just allow yourself, and I talk about this in Das Cafe I'm Running About. This is the story of the sea turtle, that when the tide is going against you, allow yourself to just hold your position. Don't lose ground, But
Mm.
don't feel like you need to be paddling furiously all the time, because sometimes that's not the flow of the situation.
Yeah, sometimes you need, for example, to take a break, to go for a walk, or to sleep over something and let your subconscious work. Because
Yeah, exactly. And and sometimes it's not even you. Sometimes it's that there's other dynamics at play which sort of need to coalesce. And when they coalesce, then all the different pieces are exactly where they need to be, so that you can have that stroke of genius creativity to bring something from a blank piece of paper to something that's real.
I see. Thank you. So the thing is, what I still like when I if I would write a book, I mean, I've written one book, like an ebook in the past. Um, I I started with like a mind map and with the table of contents. Do you
Hmm.
recommend that as well, or do you have a different approach as to like what to write about and what elements do you need?
It depends on the type of book. So, for a nonfiction book, I find that process to be really valuable. I like the visual aspect of being able to look at it, whether you use post-it notes on a wall or you use a Excel spreadsheet that sort of maps it all out. I like the ability to look and follow the storyline and say, okay, yeah, if I'm going to go from here to here, this one's a chapter about dealing with fears. This one is a chapter that ties into that because it's talking about the changes in the brain when we don't get our dopamine fix. And so you can see the whole storyline and see if it makes sense. And I've written one book that way. I wrote the sequel to the Big Five for Life book that way. And I think the reason that I did it is because I was telling a story that wasn't just of my own creation. I was in part telling a story of this amazing company called DLGL up in Montreal, Canada. But that said, when I do my other books that are just pure creative flow, I will I will know that I'm going to do the project probably for 12 months ahead of time. And during those 12 months, I keep my great idea file. And every time I think of a really cool thought, a unique piece of intellectual capital, I type it up into my Microsoft Word document and I just store it on my Mac. And then when it comes time to actually start the process of writing the book, I read through that entire document of thoughts and ideas. And then I sit down and I just start typing. And so that process is different. When I get stuck, then I go back and I look at the entire file. I'm like, oh, yeah, this is a perfect spot for that idea. And I drop it in. So I think part of it is depending on the type of book you're writing, and part of it is depending on the type of person you are and the way your brain functions.
I see. Do you ever worry about, for example, having some other author or inspirational motivator or speaker that he might have come up with the same idea and you just don't know about it, or do you not care at all about that?
My guess is that if you looked across human history, as far back as we have dated material, that some thoughts and ideas have transcended cultures and time frames throughout all of human history. So the idea of asking the question, which is sort of the core question in Das Cafe I'm running about, why am I here? My guess is that's a question that people have been asking for all of eternity. So I don't think that you want to sell yourself short and say, well, somebody already asked that. Well, yeah, somebody asked it, but what's the creative way in which your genius is going to ask it? And will that way connect to someone in a way that somebody else's book doesn't? It's incredibly intimidating. If you were to walk into the Frankfurt Book Fair, for example, in October every year, there are probably 500,000 titles on display there.
Yeah.
And you look at your one little book and you're like, how in the world is anyone going to find my little book out of all that? But if everyone thought that, then no one would write anything down. And then we wouldn't have a chance to be doing this podcast. And there wouldn't be millions of people around the world who have been inspired by the books. You kind of just got to trust your intuition. If there's a reason it's saying to you, write this sales letter or write this book or try this entrepreneurial venture, if you're getting that kind of internal calling, there's got to be a reason. I mean, there's a million other things you could be doing. If it's that calling, if it's calling you with that much intensity, there's got to be a reason.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button and never miss an episode of Svencast again.